Hi everyone, this is Emily Steelhammer with Connecting in Color, and this is a step-by-step tutorial for what I call a thankful sunset. What you will need is a large mop brush, a smaller mop brush, a detail brush, a spouncer, which is really just a round sponge on a stick, also a fine sea sponge, which is great for texture, and a wooden skewer. I also use acrylic paint in all my classes, so today I'm using acrylic-based craft paint. And the first thing you want to do is pick the colors for your background, which in this case is the sky and the water. First, I chose the basic sunset colors, which are white, a deep mustard yellow called King's Gold, red, and for the water, I used a dark blue with a white. Once I have the colors, I'm going to load up my mop brush with the brightest color, which is white, even a tiny bit of yellow too. Then I'm going to start at the top corner and make one long stroke across the top and come on back, connecting both sides of the canvas. All the way across and all the way back. Not only does it blend the colors well, it keeps the strokes from looking choppy or uneven. Fun fact, my mop brushes might look a little funny to you because they are actually makeup brushes from the dollar store of all places. You do not need to spend $10 or more on a big mop brush. At first, I got them for the cost savings so that the residents in my classes wouldn't ruin my good brushes. But now I've actually really learned to like them. They are so soft that the colors blend really smoothly on the canvas, which makes sense if you think about it because they're made to blend makeup on your face. If you don't know how to blend properly, you may sometimes get a sky with stripes. To help with that, just use your brush and go over the seam. Just like that. So now that I've gone from white to yellow, I'm ready to add my darker colors, starting with the red. I'm not even going to wash my brush, I'm just going to dip right in. The color will start blending and begin to get darker as you continue. Now I'm ready to do the water. All the colors are still on my brush from the sky, but I'm still not going to wash my brush. Just starting where the sky ended, I'm going to continue with the long strokes back and forth, all the way to the bottom of the canvas. If you only use blue, the water will look a little flat. So to fix that, I'm going to add some strokes of white. Still not washing my brush, I'm going to add some waves. But when you think waves, you usually think the cartoon like pointy waves or sound waves. But really, I'm just going to add some shorter strokes in various places, lining up with the same straight strokes we used for the background. And there's the background. At this point in a class, the paint has already dried when they get to the bottom, but since I work much faster, I'm going to use my hairdryer to dry the background before moving on. So now that the background is dry and ready to go, we can start adding details. I always say to start with the things that are furthest away from you and work your way forward with detail. In this case, the next detail closer to us would be the sun. And to do this, I use what's called a spouncer, which, like I mentioned before, is really just a round sponge on a stick. I don't know about you, but I can't paint a perfect circle, so I assume that many of my first-time painters will have the same problem. This tool really helps in a lot of my classes, and I tell them to use it just like a stamp. So I'm going to load the spouncer up with some white and yellow. The trick is to make sure that before you go to the canvas that the whole circle is covered with paint. Make sure none of the blue is showing. I like to blend the colors a little bit on the sponge as well. I suggest if you're not sure what it'll look like that you practice on a piece of paper first. Because the sun is setting, I want half my sun to be hidden, so I'm going to place it half in the sky and half in the water. Just press down like a stamp and pull up. And there you go. Sometimes I do it a second time in the same spot just to get the bubbles out. Now I'm going to move on to my smaller mop brush and begin to work on the land. I'm going to use black for this step. A lot of my classes ask, why do you use black in sunset paintings? So I explain that when the sun sets, everything is in shadow. Without light, our eyes also can't see color, which causes everything to look black. The first thing we need to do is add a horizon line, which will go straight across where the sky meets the water. Also going right across the sun so it looks like it's setting. Just like that. Because land is rarely perfectly flat, I'm also going to add a few waves at the top of the line and add a slight hill on the right side. That way it is not a perfectly straight line. For depth, I'm going to alternate sides I add the islands on. On the left side, about halfway down the water, I'm going to add a line that lines up right about underneath the sun. And I'm also going to create another hill, but on the left side instead of the right of the line. On the bottom of the canvas, I'm going to add the mainland, basically where we would be standing if we were looking at this scene. That's also going to be a line going all the way across, but at the bottom of the canvas, and another hill on the right side. Just like before, I'm going to make a couple hills and make a hill right on the right side. Basically, a repeat of what we did for the horizon line. Just make sure that the hills aren't exactly the same. So the land is in now, but I don't like how clean cut it looks. So I'm going to add some texture to make it look like grass or brush growing. All you have to do is take your brush and kind of bounce it, holding it straight up and down. If you aren't sure how, try it out on a separate piece of paper, but it'll give you a nice grassy texture. I'm going to use a little bit of black and maybe even a little bit of gold as well for this. Make sure that you don't bounce a straight line in, but try to vary it to be different heights and thicknesses. And I'm going to do this all the way across my mainland. Another thing I like to do when doing grass, a lot of my residents like doing this as well, is taking a wooden skewer, specifically the pointed end. And what you do is you can just scratch upwards into the paint. Now you want to make sure you do this while it's wet, specifically because you don't need any paint on the skewer. You're going to just take advantage of the color that's behind the layer of paint you just used and scratch upwards. You'll be able to see some grassy lines. Again, just make sure you don't make them all the same height, and they can kind of be, they don't have to be straight up and down either. They could be crossing in front of each other, leaning to the left or the right. Make sure they're all different. Another thing you want to do is always make sure you're starting at the bottom of a blade of grass and flick upwards. Flick upwards, just like you would if you were painting a line. Some people like to paint grass by starting at the top, and I say not to do that because when you do pull up, it will taper off on the end, come to a little point. So if you were to do this from top to bottom, your grass would actually look upside down. And I went all the way across with this texture. I'm going to do the same thing to the island in the middle as well. Now, the horizon line, I'm going to leave that go. I'm not going to do the same texture for that because I think, one, it'll make it too busy, and two, we're going to have a lot going on with the trees we're about to add in next. So next thing I want you to do is switch your brush and move on to the detail brush. Now we are going to create some tree trunks, also with black. So the first thing you want to do is figure out where you're going to plant your trees. Starting at the ground and grow it straight up into the sky. You can add as many trees as you want. I just suggest spacing them out a little bit and make sure they are also all different heights. Don't worry, a lot of people freak out when I say for them to make a straight line. They say, Emily, I can't paint a straight line. Well, guess what? Trees aren't always perfectly straight either, so yours don't have to be as well. In fact, I kind of like some of my trees leaning different directions. I think that gives them a little bit more personality and a natural feel. So I'm going to add a few trees on my island here and some on the right side of the mainland. And I also want to have a clear view of the sunset since that's the focus of this painting. So next we get to move on to one of my favorite steps. All of my classes love using these, and that is a sea sponge. They make adding leaves and different textures so much easier. For these trees, I'm going to use a fine sea sponge specifically, and again, a little bit of black. All you have to do is tap the sponge lightly. The lighter you tap, the thinner the leaves. The harder you tap, the thicker the leaves. I would definitely suggest practicing on a separate piece of paper until you understand how the texture should look and how much pressure you should use when tapping. So you only need a little bit of paint. You don't need to coat the entire sponge, just the tip. And I'm going to start near the bottom of the tree and kind of alternate back and forth over the trunk, moving my way up to the top. I also suggest starting light and making it thicker as needed. It's really neat to see how the sky colors show through the black texture. So make sure not to make it completely blacked out. I also noticed that I'm making texture thicker near the bottom and thinner near the top to make it look somewhat pointed, almost like an evergreen tree. Now, a lot of people can get carried away with this texture technique as well, so make sure you start simple and then add more as you think's needed. Sometimes less is more, especially with a fine sponge. And there we go. How easy was that? So at this point, I would say you have a finished painting. And with some classes, if I can sense that their patience is wearing thin, I would stop it here. However, I'm going to assume that you have a little bit more patience if you got through this entire tutorial, so I'm going to give you a couple more suggestions. One thing I personally like to do is add white over the top of some of my black leaves. This gives them a little highlight and looks like the sun is shining on them as it sets. I'm going to add this the exact same way as I did the black, just not quite as much. If it goes on a little too bright at first, you can also just do a little bit more black texture over it as well. If you have a fan brush, like I said, this is optional, and I didn't plan on using this one in the beginning, but this could be neat, so let's see what happens. What you can do with a fan brush is add another kind of tall grass. What I do is load up the tip of the brush and use it just so the bristles are vertical by tapping around the top edges of my land. I like the texture, first of all, of the fan brush when you do this, and also how the tip kind of curves to one side or the other depending on what direction you tap. You could always use a thinner detail brush as well to add some grasses, but again, I kind of like the texture of a fan brush. Again, make sure the grasses are all different heights, and some can cross over each other, just like we did when we were scratching with the skewer. Now, one thing a lot of people ask me to do, they want to add birds in the sky. And I'm always hesitant to do this, especially if you're not used to using a brush. You can really mess up your sky. So what I suggest for new painters is actually using a Sharpie or a fine black pen. All you have to do is, again, practice this first, but make a wide V. And make sure the ends, it's a wide V, but you can kind of curve the ends out to make it look like a bird flying. Also, if you use a Sharpie, make sure that the background is completely dry. And there we go. Now, there might be other suggestions that you have. I always say, feel free to make the painting your own. Again, at the end, those were a couple of things that I thought of that I wanted to try. Everybody usually has their own take on a painting, or might have a memory that this might be somewhere they went on a family vacation, or might remind them of a specific fishing spot, in which case I encourage them to add personal details of different things that they might have seen in that scene. Or if you want to follow me step by step as well, I never hold it against you. That's great if you're looking for instruction and just trying something new. So, thank you for watching this tutorial. Here you have it, a thankful sunset. It's definitely been a learning curve to think about the camera and explaining things while painting. So let me know what you think, and if you have any suggestions or questions about the video, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and happy painting!